Hello, hello, hello. All right, we are continuing our discussion of wealth talks. I've given an overview of what this series of talks is going to be about. We've started talking about the biblical principles. So we've talked about the love of money and being a wealthy Christian are two different things. Today we're moving on to the second biblical principle, which is striving to be a Christian who blesses others is godly. Striving to be a Christian who blesses others is godly. So the scriptures here are Proverbs 13:22. Proverbs 13:22. And again, I'm reading this to you out of the NIV, New International Version of the Bible. And it says, "A good person leaves an inheritance for their children's children, but a sinner's wealth is stored up for the righteous." In my commentary on this text, Proverbs 13:22, notice that a good person leaves an inheritance to their children's children, that is, their grandchildren, and the sinner's wealth is stored up for the righteous. First, as parents and adults, we should strive to leave our children and grands better off than we started. Yes, it's important to leave the next generation a godly example, love, service, and more. However, we should also strive to leave them some wealth. All right? So, of course, you can't go hungry, starving to death, because, we're going to always play this to the extremes. So we ought not live in poverty so our children can be millionaires. That's not the teaching of the text. However, we ought to look at how much money we spend past what we need and see, are we using any of our discretionary income to help the next generation be better off financially? And yes, in order for that to be the case, not only do they need finances, but then they also need financial literacy and discipline. Because you could leave money for the next generation and then they waste it buying some kind of a sports car that they go out and crash and all that kind of crazy stuff. All right? But the ideal is each generation should build on the wealth of the previous generation. A second ideal here is the text teaches that sinners may have wealth, but somehow it ends up with the righteous. All right? Somehow it ends up with the righteous. I'm not sure how exactly that happens, because it looks like there's some sinners, some wicked people who have held on to their wealth a long time. So I'm not exactly sure how this text plays out, but it's interesting to note that sinners can have wealth temporarily, and the righteous will end up with the wealth, which means righteous people can be wealthy. All right? There are some church folk who give you the impression that there's something sanctified and holy about being poor and living paycheck to paycheck and working 40 years of their life and trying to live off of Social Security and just struggling all their life. I think if you study the Bible, if you can look past what church folks saying and read the Bible, you find out that the Bible got a lot more sense than the church folk. This text in the Old Testament is saying that somehow the sinner's wealth ends up in the hands of the righteous, which means you can be righteous and wealthy. The application sentence here simply says, let's strive to pass wealth on to our next generations and focus on being right with God instead of just having temporary wealth and yet a sinner. So get focused on trying to pass wealth on, which means you got to develop some wealth in order to pass wealth on, right, to the next generations. And we know, even though it's not written in the text, you got to have some sense to know that if I'm going to pass wealth on to the next generation, I need to also help them understand how to manage it and have the discipline to take care of it, or else the wealth will die in their generation and not get to the next one. This is where our focus should be, as opposed to just trying to have temporary wealth and still a sinner in the eyes of God. Proverbs 13:22. Then the second and last passage for this talk is Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46. Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46. This text is a bit much to read. In summary, the sheep were on the right side of the Lord and were commended for helping Jesus when he was in need. They did this by helping people who were in need. The goats on the left side of Jesus were rebuked because they did not help Jesus when he was in need. They didn't help Jesus when they didn't help people who were in need. Those are the summary highlights of Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46. My commentary on that is, notice the emphasis on helping people with things like food, clothing, companionship, etc. In order to help people with practical needs, we need to have enough resources to share with others. If we really want to help those in need, we would do more than simply give a hungry person a sandwich. We would help them get a job and or open a business so they can buy their own food. We would also strive to improve systems that lead to people living in poverty and oppression. Let's strive to be like sheep who bless people instead of like goats who don't help. All right? So when you read Matthew 25, 31 through 46, you should walk away from the text saying, Lord, help me be a sheep and not a goat. And what that means is, Lord, help me be a blessing to others. Now, it's going to be hard to be a blessing to others who have practical needs if you don't have resources to bless them with. So the sheep didn't just pray for Jesus when he was hungry. They gave him something to eat. They didn't just pray for him when he was naked. They gave him some clothes. If you broke, or you just living from paycheck to paycheck and just happy with Jesus being broke and living paycheck to paycheck, how are you going to help the person who is down and out? All right. So the principle I'm developing with Matthew 25 and Proverbs 13 is striving to be a Christian who blesses others is godly. All right. So that's the second principle. So remember, the first principle was the love of money and being a wealthy Christian are two different things. The second principle that we talked about today was striving to be a Christian who blesses others is godly. All right, hang in there. We're going somewhere. Next time, we're going to talk about how wealth building calls for our being wise stewards of what God has placed in our trust. Take care.